This Thursday is October 31st, widely recognized as Halloween. For Lutherans, however, this date has another special significance. According to Lutheran lore, October 31st, 1517 is the day that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the bulletin board on the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg so that it would be read by everyone attending All Saints Mass the next day. These 95 Theses, also called Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, harshly criticized the church's practice of selling indulgences, which encouraged people to purchase peaceful passage from purgatory to a future heavenly realm. Like most forces of evil in the world, the practice of selling indulgences had the largest impact on the poor and the marginalized. The wealthy, who had the means to purchase luxury items, could purchase these indulgences without significant impact on their ability to live well in the present. But indulgences were not marketed as luxury items. They were marketed using guilt and scare tactics aimed at enticing even the poorest to buy in, to the detriment of their own health and well-being. Through spiritual manipulation, the poor were being robbed of their already fragile ability to live. This disproportionate impact on the poor and marginalized is a key indicator that forces of evil are at work. In the promises we make at baptism and again at confirmation, we are asked three questions. Do you renounce the devil and all the forces that defy God? Do you renounce the powers of this world that rebel against God? And finally, do you renounce the ways of sin that draw you from God? Each of these questions is a version, more or less, of the same thing. Do you now, and do you promise to continue to work against evil in the world? Evil is alive and well in the world, and one of the quickest ways to spot evil at work in our institutions is to notice where the poor and the marginalized are disproportionately impacted. As Lutherans, we are called to be reformers. Our tradition is named for a passionate and deeply flawed man who spoke up against evil in his institution. He used his voice to speak truth to power, to say, hey, you with all the power, what you're doing is not okay. The poor and everyday people are suffering, and I will no longer let you just keep ignoring it. Martin Luther was a troublemaker. He made a big stink about what the church was doing, and people did not like it. He spoke truth to power, and he paid the price through his own excommunication. Our world today continues to be filled with evil that can be easily spotted because it disproportionately impacts the poor and marginalized. Evil policies and practices exist in all of our institutions, in our government, in our schools, our banks, our businesses, and yes, in our churches. As Christians, and especially as Lutherans, we are called to renounce this evil, to make a stink, to cause some trouble. It's in our baptismal vows. The book, Baptized We Live, by Dan Erlander, is one of my favorite resources to share with people who are interested in becoming Lutheran. In this book, Erlander talks about Lutheranism not as a set of beliefs, but as a way of life. He talks about it as a movement, and one of the markers of this Lutheran movement is that it is reforming. Reforming. The ing is the most important part. We are a people who have experienced Reformation, but reform is not over. To be Lutheran is to be always reforming. It's a very good thing that our call and vocation is to be reforming, because we are a group of imperfect people, like any other group in that way. Whatever we are doing is always going to be flawed. There's always going to be room for growth. The thing that hopefully makes us different is that our theological grounding in grace gives us the space to receive feedback and accept our need to change without needing to defend ourselves. We don't need to justify ourselves. Through grace, we know that our worth transcends our shortcomings. Our worth and acceptance by God is not threatened by the fact that we are also in need of reform. So on this day, let's practice a way of life, like Dan Erlander says, that makes space for feedback in the interest of reforming. The church as it is today is so far from fully embodying the kingdom of God. And by the church, I mean the Church of Christ across the whole globe. I mean the ELCA. I mean St. Andrew in particular. We, the church, at all those different levels, we do embody the kingdom of God in many ways, but there is also room for growth at all of those levels. I mentioned how the selling of indulgences disproportionately impacted the poor and marginalized, and that this is one of the markers of something that is in need of reform, having a disproportionate negative impact on the marginalized. So I invite you to consider, who are the marginalized in our community? Who has the least power in our own family? Who has the least power in the St. Andrew Church family? Who has the least power in the Beaverton area? Who has the least power in the state of Oregon? Who are the marginalized? And what practices of the church keep the marginalized marginalized? What practices of the church prioritize the ones who are already comfortable? What are some reforms that we could make as a church community, either the congregation of St. Andrew in particular or the larger ELCA? What are some of the reforms that we could make that would prioritize the marginalized? What reforms could we make that would create a more inclusive community? A community with fewer barriers for those who are not already part of the in crowd. What reforms could we make that would show how much we value the voice and the needs of other people? You have your Post-its, you have your pencils. I have more, so I'll walk around too to make sure you have enough. We have a moment after the sermon now to contemplate. And today, let's take 2 minutes for contemplation instead of our usual 1, so that people have time to contemplate and then write. Write a reform or 95 reforms that you would like to post on the door in the back. And then during the singing of the hymn of the day, you'll be invited to post your reform or hand it to someone else to post for you. If you are online, I encourage you to write in the chat your reforms if you're on Zoom. Otherwise, this is something you can do in your own journal and only share it if you would like. Take a moment to contemplate and then write, and then we will sing.